I'm not running a boiler room operation. I have no phony real estate scam. I'm not taking any kickbacks. I did steal a ring from Woolworths once when I was 12 years old.
Johnny Carson, the king of late-night television, could make millions laugh with just a look, a pause, or a perfectly timed joke. But not every guest who sat across from him shared that effortless chemistry. Behind the camera's warm glow and polished smiles, there were moments of tension, awkward silences, and even quiet resentment. Even the master of smooth conversation had his limits, and some guests pushed them too far. From comedy legends who refused to go off script to stars who turned playful banter into bitter standoffs, there are 16 unforgettable names that Carson, despite his professionalism, could barely tolerate. One confrontation became so personal, it didn't just play out on stage, it happened behind closed doors. Who were these guests? And what did they do to land themselves on Johnny Carson's most unwanted list? Let's find out. Bob Hope. Bob Hope, one of the most legendary comedians in American entertainment history, was surprisingly one of Johnny Carson's least favorite guests on The Tonight Show. Despite both being icons of comedy, their professional relationship was notably strained. The primary reason for Carson's dislike stemmed from Hope's rigid and heavily scripted style of performance, which clashed with Carson's preference for natural, spontaneous conversation. Hope would often send the show's producers a list of topics and pre-written jokes ahead of his appearances, essentially reducing Carson to a prop whose role was to set up punchlines rather than engage in genuine dialogue. Carson stood the sharpest of wits and was an excellent interviewer who thrived on organic interaction with his guests. But the interviews with Hope were all very forced and almost formulaic. His cue cards rehearsed one-liners, and utter lack of any kind of improvisational engagement were extremely frustrating to Carson, who once said that to him, interviewing Hope was like talking to a giant promotional machine. This was especially true in that most of Hope's appearances involved some tie-in to a special or project instead of simply being to entertain the audience. Alas, interview became yet another synonym for promotion or advertisement. Not to mention that the usual show producers felt they had little choice but to get Hope on the air, just punching that Hollywood royalty ticket and moving on whether he had anything new or old to say. This didn't help irritate Carson, who would rather have a conversation than an appearance. Carson's discomfort with Hope became more apparent years later during the comedian's decline, when he was adopting styles of humor that seemed even less attuned to common contemporary humor. Ultimately, while Carson always maintained professionalism on the air, it was well known behind the scenes that Bob Hope was one of the few guests he genuinely disliked having on The Tonight Show. Think Carson was patient with Hope's scripted jokes? Just wait until loyalty gets thrown out the window. Joan Rivers. Joan Rivers was once one of Johnny Carson's favorite guests and a trusted guest host on The Tonight Show, but their relationship ended in one of the most infamous late-night television feuds. Early in her career, Rivers became a frequent guest on Carson's show, where he admired her quick wit, bold humor, and sharp banter. She was often invited to guest host, leading many to believe she was being groomed as Carson's potential successor. However, despite their strong on-air chemistry, Rivers's brash personality and aggressive comedic style sometimes clashed with Carson's more controlled and polished hosting approach. The actual climax came in their relationship in 1986, when Joan Rivers finally agreed to accept an offer to host her own late-night talk show, The Late Show starring Joan Rivers, over the newly formed Fox network. What particularly offended Carson was not that Rivers took the job, but that she chose not to personally inform him before the news broke. Carson could not believe that she would do this to him after so long, in what he viewed as a disloyal act after he had helped her in her career. The moment Rivers tried to call Carson to explain herself, Carson, however, refused to take her calls, breaking all communication with her. As a direct result of this rift, Carson blacklisted Joan Rivers from The Tonight Show, a prohibition that lingered for a nearly 30-year period, even assuming the host changed as it routinely happened. Jay Leno, who held the post as host afterward, couldn't make an exception to this same ban for reasons of simple respect for Carson. It was only in 2014 that Rivers was able to return to The Tonight Show under the new host Jimmy Fallon, one of the icons in television history, and when they had their head-to-head personal feud. His famous achievement became a very stern reminder of how Carson valued loyalty and severed all professional relationships by what he viewed as a personal betrayal. Wayne Newton. Johnny Carson's feud with Wayne Newton remains one of the most notorious conflicts in late-night television history. While Carson was famous for his sharp wit and playful jabs at celebrities, his repeated jokes about Newton went beyond light-hearted teasing. Carson frequently mocked Newton's flamboyant style, high-pitched voice, and over-the-top Las Vegas performances, often implying that Newton lacked traditional masculinity. Unlike many celebrities who laughed off Carson's jokes, Newton took the mockery personally, viewing it as an attack on his character and career. The rift between the two deepened when Wayne Newton confronted Johnny Carson face-to-face in what became a momentous behind-the-scenes clash. According to reports, Newton barged into Carson's office at NBC, physically intimidating him and demanding that the jokes stop. Newton, well connected to Las Vegas and with a reputation for being tough, stated unequivocally that there would be repercussions if Carson continued to make light of him on the air. The incident, however, shook Carson, whose style was usually not prescriptive or coercive, but instead made use of humor and soft touches to address differences between people. After that confrontation, Carson tightened up a little on the jokes regarding Newton, but by that stage, it was too late for their relationship. Although Carson still played the game when Newton came on as a guest, the two were not on friendly terms, and Carson was probably not too fond of Newton being around due to possessive tensions attached to their personal histories. It is this feud that sets Carson's tussle with Newton apart. It was perhaps one of the rare instances where his humor misfired, and in the bargain created a row that could not be signed on television's imaginary line. Their confrontation celebrates the failure of personal pride before public ridicule in the business of making entertainment. Charlton Heston. Charlton Heston, the legendary actor known for his iconic roles in Ben-Hur, The Ten Commandments, and Planet of the Apes, was one of Johnny Carson's more difficult guests on The Tonight Show. Heston's serious, commanding presence often clashed with Carson's preference for relaxed, humorous conversation. Unlike many Hollywood stars who engaged in light-hearted banter, Heston maintained a formal and intense demeanor, turning interviews into stiff and overly serious exchanges that lacked spontaneity. Heston's long, self-important discourse on movies, moral beliefs, or politics was torture for Carson to deal with, since it did not allow Carson to maintain a good comic energy on the set. The conflict was exacerbated by Heston's very curious conservative political views, especially his position as president of the NRA from 1998 to 2003. While Carson would normally shy away from deep political discussions therein, it was just that Heston's serious and sometimes polarizing beliefs would up the ante of discomfort for the host. Carson was able to maintain a veneer of professionalism with Heston, whose contrasting demeanor indeed created a forbidding atmosphere on air. Carson thrived on frenetic, slapstick exchanges, while Heston injected an almost grim solemnity into the banter that was sorely out of place in the light-hearted late-night venue that was The Tonight Show. Don Rickles. Don Rickles, the legendary insult comic, was both a beloved and challenging guest for Johnny Carson on The Tonight Show. Known for his rapid-fire insults and unpredictable energy, Rickles was a crowd favorite who often left audiences in stitches. However, while Carson appreciated Rickles's comedic genius, he also found his chaotic style to be disruptive at times. Rickles tended to take over the show, ignoring the typical structure of a late-night interview and turning every appearance into a comedic free-for-all. His relentless teasing often targeted Carson himself, pushing boundaries in ways that few other guests dared. One of the well-known events that brought into the limelight their chemistry as host and guest was when Rickles broke Carson's cigarette box while guest hosting The Tonight Show. Carson humorously entered the set of CPO Sharkey, then Rickles's show, just to confront him. Such antics create a mountain of the most unscripted moments in late-night history. Such antics, however, amused the audience, but were often cross-testing at Carson's back mind as the streak-hanging Josh puts up on the network with Rickles. So much for the showbiz wall that Carson wanted to bestow. In spite of this, really, Carson could go through the worst sides of Rickles with a deep mutual respect and an unusual comic chemistry. Carson knew very well that he could convert Rickles's erratic behavior into unforgettable moments on television. Not to mention, he was clearly a part of this large aspect of Rickles in boundary pushing, fabricating grandiose personality traits, and blowing out to the host mad sound. An asset, but a source of much frustrating sentiment for Carson. George Carlin. George Carlin, one of the most influential comedians of his time, was a guest on The Tonight Show several times early in his career. However, as Carlin's comedic style evolved, it became increasingly clear that he and Johnny Carson did not share the same sensibilities, leading to a strained professional relationship. While Carson appreciated talented comedians, he favored those whose humor fit the show's mainstream, family-friendly tone. Carlin, on the other hand, became known for his countercultural, rebellious routines that challenged social norms and tackled controversial topics like politics, religion, and societal hypocrisy. As Carlin transitioned into more provocative and boundary-pushing material during the 1970s, Carson began to exhibit reluctance toward regular appearances by Carlin on The Tonight Show. Carson was known to espouse professionalism and control in the structure of his show, whereas Carlin's unpredictable tendencies were buried against such ideas. Indeed, Carlin's propensity for pushing sensitive areas and challenging the artistic boundaries of comedy might have caused Carson to feel apprehensive about extending this risk of putting him on late-night TV, especially when considering Carson's huge and diverse audience. Carson remained a very reserved and private person. He preferred guests who could engage in light banter without getting into heated arguments over controversial or polarizing matters. Carlin's rise as a counterculture icon simply didn't fit into the kind of show Carson had cultivated for The Tonight Show. While Carlin's genius as a comic was indisputable, the divergence between the kind of comedy that began to develop in Carlin's hands and the type of show Carson had envisioned for The Tonight Show quickly froze any professional conviviality. As a result, the report has it that in later years, Carson began to shun Carlin, opting for guests better suited within the structured and entertainment-oriented forum of The Tonight Show. Zsa Zsa Gabor. Zsa Zsa Gabor, the glamorous Hungarian-American actress and socialite, was one of the guests Johnny Carson reportedly found difficult to host on The Tonight Show. Known for her larger-than-life personality, extravagant lifestyle, and endless stories about her wealth and relationships, Gabor often dominated conversations in a way that clashed with Carson's more understated and sarcastic style. Rather than engaging in the playful banter that Carson preferred, Gabor would frequently steer the discussion toward herself, making it difficult for Carson to guide the interview or insert his signature humor. Carson reportedly found diva behavior combined with flamboyance as one of the main turnoff points about Gabor's appearance on the show. Even if it amused some viewers, the host preferred freshness and guests who could laugh at themselves taking some subtle shots at him. Gabor took herself too seriously, or she lacked self-awareness, making it difficult for Carson's humor to work in many instances. Also, her over-flirting with male hosts, inclusive of Carson himself, sometimes created cringe-worthy moments on air and predictably complicated the whole thing. Carson, behind the doors, has such a controlled professional endeavor and should, rather, control the whole comic concert. He really had to work the audience, and self-centered stories and unpredictable nonsense by Gabor often disturbed that balance. It has always left Carson in places quite visibly thrown out during her appearances. Gabor entertained the crowds in The Tonight Show, but it became impossible to have her around because she failed to match Carson's style of humor and was intimidatingly overbearing. And so the two were differences in kind and in style in the conversation, resulting in a forced on-screen emotional chemistry that Carson will not look forward to repeating. Fred Rogers. Fred Rogers, famously known as Mr. Rogers from the beloved children's television program Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, was a deeply respected guest on The Tonight Show. However, despite Rogers' positive public image and important work in children's education, Johnny Carson reportedly found interviewing him to be challenging. Their vastly different on-air styles created a noticeable contrast. Carson thrived on sharp wit, sarcasm, and playful banter, while Rogers was calm, deeply sincere, and avoided humor at the expense of others. Carson, to his dismay, found himself in difficulties with Rogers for comedic relief. Much different than having a conversation with most of the guests, Rogers, in his earnest and gentle way, would make it tough for Carson to not seem awful. Carson found it that much harder to mix and lighten things up without being disrespectful, given that there was a kind of almost saintly persona to Rogers' image, especially in the eyes of his millions of young fans. Rogers' focus was inherently on childhood development, emotional well-being, and kindness, with themes that fit nowhere alongside the escapism of The Tonight Show's environment. It was clear that Carson had some degree of discomfort during these Rogers segments, not from any real-life arguments with or dislikes of Rogers, but simply because, in their different television worlds, they somehow didn't mesh well within the comic and fast-paced confines of The Tonight Show. Keep your seatbelt fastened, because this next guest took awkward interviews to a whole new level. Harry Belafonte. Harry Belafonte, the legendary singer, actor, and civil rights activist, was a highly respected figure in the entertainment industry, but he was also one of the more difficult guests for Johnny Carson on The Tonight Show. While Carson admired Belafonte's talent and humanitarian work, their interview styles and television personas were starkly different, creating an awkward dynamic on air. Belafonte, famous for hits like Day-O, the Banana Boat song, wasn't just an entertainer. He was deeply committed to activism and often used his platform to discuss important social issues, including racial justice, civil rights, and global humanitarian concerns. Those types of incidents sounded like a complicated puzzle for Carson because he loved to remain lighthearted, genial, and escapist at night for his audience. Laughs didn't matter in the coming show without his playful banter, spontaneous jokes, and interesting celebrity stories, which Belafonte guided toward a serious, hard-hitting, political environment. The man, on whose show of political concern was rarely pouring judgment, was not known for covering any sensitive issues, such as race and social justice, which happened to be the very problems dear to Belafonte's mission. It was the case that made the interviews difficult for Carson involving the routing of this topic under which his ability to draw humor ended. Despite Carson's respect and professionalism when treating matters related to Belafonte's attempts as a guest, this guest-host dichotomy became a very real and difficult one. Carson really liked control and consistency in the comedy rhythm at The Tonight Show, which was severely disrupted by Belafonte's impassioned personality with his activist-governed conversation style. These interviews were certainly unique and thought-provoking, but they went somewhere far from the regular Tonight Show crowd. In fact, Belafonte was perhaps one of the few guests that Carson found to be really difficult to deal with in his typically preferred comic style, even though his seriousness and activism are very admirable. Chevy Chase. Chevy Chase, the Saturday Night Live alum and popular comedy actor, was one of the guests Johnny Carson reportedly found difficult and unpleasant to have on The Tonight Show. Unlike many comedians who came on the show eager to engage in Carson's playful and natural style of banter, Chase often projected an air of arrogance and superiority. This clashed with Carson's more relaxed yet authoritative approach to hosting. Chase's reputation for being smug and self-important in Hollywood was well known, and these qualities reportedly created tension whenever he appeared on The Tonight Show. Carson's aversion to having Chase on the program was compounded by the striking differences of their styles of comedy. Carson was known to be somewhat caustic, yet he also was gracious and charming enough to put his guests and audience at ease. Chase's humor was laced so heavily with sarcasm, deadpan delivery, and sometimes even that glint of cruel humor that it broke the jolly rhythm that Carson so painstakingly worked to create. The exchanges between those two on air were frequently stilted, with Chase's aloof and self-indulgent demeanor depriving Carson of the ability to generate the instances of unscripted whimsy and humor that were the hallmarks of his interviews. Speculation also existed that Carson might have regarded Chase as a rival more than a friendly guest. Having gained fame in the mid-1970s as a breakout star from SNL, Chase's ambitions were rumored to lead him to VA for the next king of late-night television. Protective of his station as the reigning late-night host, Carson could have regarded younger comedians like Chase as prospective successors with suspicion. This possible rivalry, coupled with Chase's difficult-to-analyze personality, created palpable coldness whenever those two were together and turned Chase into one of Carson's least favorite guests throughout the latter's long, winding journey on The Tonight Show. Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra, one of the most legendary entertainers of the 20th century, was a highly anticipated guest on The Tonight Show, but his appearances were not always enjoyable for Johnny Carson. While Sinatra's star power guaranteed big ratings, his larger-than-life personality and occasional arrogance clashed with Carson's controlled and polished hosting style. Sinatra was known for being dismissive or even rude if things didn't go his way, and this attitude sometimes created behind-the-scenes tension. Carson, who valued professionalism and maintaining authority over his show, found Sinatra's behavior disruptive, especially when it interfered with the show's smooth pacing. Sinatra barged in on that monologue by walking in on Carson, and that, of course, was one of the most infamous events. He interrupts Carson in mid-joke to enter into his monologue. Although Carson managed it with great grace and humor, that little drama was widely believed to be a power play on Sinatra's part, basking in all of his glory as he loved to do. Carson, however, would never appreciate that kind of behavior that contradicted his all-out preference for neat, carefully staged interviews structured in such a way that the host guided the show, not the guest. That was a scale that fell beyond the limits of coming to Carson. It happened under the scrutiny of Carson, who made it customary to be the one calling the shots at a venue. The backstage demands and entourage of Sinatra increased the pressure. He almost invariably brought along an entourage of scores of his buddies and companions, making rehearsal and show day production a painful ordeal for Carson, often with some added stress for him and his staff. Although Carson never really lambasted Sinatra in public, their relationship as professional beings indicated a kind of uneasy relationship between them. Carson admired Sinatra and revered his legacy enough to realize that it was quite an honor to have a guest of this status. But Sinatra's diva-like whims and flouting of the Tonight Show format made him one of the toughest to handle for Carson. Bette Midler. Bette Midler, the acclaimed singer, actress, and performer, created some of the most memorable moments in the Tonight Show history, particularly during Johnny Carson's final episodes. However, despite their on-air chemistry and mutual respect, it was well known that Carson didn't entirely enjoy having Midler as a guest. The main reason for this stemmed from their vastly different personalities and styles. Carson was known for his calm, reserved demeanor and controlled approach to hosting, while Midler was bold, outspoken, and often brought a fiery energy that could dominate the stage and shift attention away from him. The sometimes chillier side of Midler herself has, off-camera, opened up on her relationship with Carson. She implied that it might have made Carson unsettled or even intimidated by her self-confidence and strong-willed nature, particularly at a time when assertiveness in female guests was rare on late-night television. Carson liked lapping guests who meshed with his conversation style and respected his territory as a host. But Midler's assertiveness would create lopsidedness from time to time. Her powerhouse performances and bold humor would have disrupted Carson's preference for a subtle, balanced exchange, rendering their relationship much more interesting than it appeared on screen. Midler's great talent was indeed respected by Carson, who understood how much entertainment she could bring to his show. At the emotional performance she gave in 1992, during Carson's penultimate episode, National Public Radio voted it one of the unforgettable moments of late-night history. She performed a heartfelt medley of songs culminating in her iconic One for My Baby. However, behind the scenes, it was clear that there was a chance Midler's larger-than-life presence and high, hard personality left Carson feeling uncomfortable, perhaps even overshadowed. In the end, this relationship was little of professional brand admiration, with a smattering of low-key personal friction as regards their different styles and how it's moving all those women in the entertainment industry. Tom Snyder. Tom Snyder, the well-known broadcaster and host of the late-night program Tomorrow, was another guest Johnny Carson reportedly did not enjoy having on The Tonight Show. The tension between the two stemmed primarily from Snyder's dominating personality and tendency to take control of conversations. As an accomplished interviewer in his own right, Snyder was used to steering discussions, often speaking at length, and overshadowing Carson during their interactions. This approach clashed with Carson's laid-back, witty style and preference for maintaining control over the show's flow. Snyder had an annoying affectation of self-promotion to make matters worse for Carson. Madison Avenue always had Snyder on a vibe of showtime, unlike Carson's cool, jocular banter that let in freestyling. Snyder sulked in his monologues, every turn quickly adopting a subject onto Snyder, even after inviting a guest comedian whom Carson expected would have an equal share of time and repartee. Carson had been impassive while on air, but it was clear that he hated interviewing. Snyder owing to Snyder's brashness and personality. Shelley Winters. Shelley Winters, the Oscar-winning actress known for her bold and outspoken personality, was one of the few guests who visibly tested Johnny Carson's patience on The Tonight Show. Winters were notorious for dominating conversations, often interrupting Carson, challenging his questions, or veering off topic entirely. This unpredictable behavior clashed with Carson's preference for smooth, controlled interviews, making her appearances a source of tension. Winter's brashness and tendency to steal the spotlight disrupted the show's natural flow, frustrating Carson, who valued guests that complimented his humor rather than overshadowed him. Winters gained notoriety for her spontaneous and sometimes contentious behavior. One memorable incident that illustrated their troubled relationship was her taking off her shoe during an interview and handing it to Carson, which made him rather annoyed. Such scenes might amuse audiences, but for a reserved and professional man like Carson, the presence of such a big character would probably be exhausting to manage. Of course, most would consider that one of the more difficult and least liked guests throughout Carson's long-running career on The Tonight Show was Winters, who fought from boldness, a total lack of propriety, and scorn for the show's unspoken rules. Norman Mailer. Norman Mailer, the controversial author and cultural critic, was one of Johnny Carson's least favorite guests on The Tonight Show due to his combative and argumentative personality. Mailer was notorious for turning interviews into intellectual sparring matches, often challenging his hosts and steering conversations into uncomfortable or polarizing topics. This approach clashed directly with Carson's style, which favored lighthearted, humorous banter over serious debates or confrontational discussions. Mailer's tendency to dominate conversations and speak at length made it difficult for Carson to maintain control and keep the show's pace lively and entertaining. Another source of contention between Carson and Mailer was that the writer was fond of working on controversial subjects concerning politics, culture, and gender issues, topics that could easily offend the late-night audience expecting mere escapist entertainment. Reportedly, Carson, who was otherwise known to shape The Tonight Show to appeal to a wider audience, found Mailer's erratic behavior and brash attitude to be a tiring accounting for him during that late-night show. Carson was always managing to maintain decorum, with the running tension being due to distinctly opposing characters. The languorous trickster show host contrasted with the fiery intellectual provocateur of Mailer, and it made Mailer one of the toughest and least received guests on the program. And finally, the guest who turned The Tonight Show into his show. This is one interview you need to see to believe. Tony Curtis. Tony Curtis, the Hollywood actor known for his charm and starring roles in classic films like Some Like It Hot and Spartacus, was reportedly a challenging guest for Johnny Carson on The Tonight Show. The primary reason for Carson's frustration with Curtis was his tendency to dominate conversations during interviews. Curtis often launched into long-winded stories about his career, personal life, and Hollywood experiences, leaving little room for Carson to guide the discussion or inject his trademark humor. Carson, who thrived on balanced, witty exchanges with his guests, likely found Curtis's habit of monopolizing the spotlight disruptive to the show's natural flow. Curtis's largely flamboyant personality did not merge with Carson's rather subdued, tailored style of hosting. Curtis was known for his unpredictable behavior and eagerness to remind audiences of his fame, most often trying to upstage Carson using theatrical anecdotes or comments that were just tangentially related to the topic. Although Carson was a superb interviewer who could deal with even the most difficult of guests, Curtis's brashness and over-the-top antics brought about some chaotic moments that went against Carson's preference for smooth, polished interviews. Instead, Curtis brought star power to The Tonight Show, but was overpoweringly present and indifferent to the subtle in his comic rhythm against which Carson had performed as a host. He was thus a guest that the legendary host did not like. And there you have it. The guest Johnny Carson just couldn't stand. Which one surprised you the most? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe for more classic Hollywood stories, and share this with a friend who loves late-night TV history. And before you go, check out the next video on your screen. We've got even more behind-the-scenes moments you won't want to miss.